right. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for our program, The Radioactive Boy Scout, a Macomb County Whiz Kid and his homemade nuclear reactor with guest Ken Silverstein. Our program is in webinar format, so your cameras and your mics are off, but feel free to use the chat or Q&A feature to ask questions. We'll actually hold all questions until the very end, but if you think of them in the middle of the talk, feel free to send them and I'll read them off to Ken at the very end. I should also mention that tonight's program is a lecture. It's not a PowerPoint, so there's no visual elements. Think of it as a live podcast where you can ask questions at the end. Our presenter tonight is Ken Silverstein. Ken is a journalist who has written for the Los Angeles Times, the Associated Press, Mother Jones, Washington Monthly, The Nation, Slate, Salon, and Harper's Magazine. He has authored numerous nonfiction books, including one that marks its 20th anniversary this year, The Radioactive Boy Scout, The True Story of a Boy and His Backyard Nuclear Reactor. Welcome, Ken, and I'll turn the screen over to you.
Thank you. Am I on?
You are indeed. Yes, you have the floor.
Okay. All right. Well, first off, thank you very much for the invitation. And it's interesting to me. This is the first time I've spoken to an audience in the area where all the events happen. So some of you may have particularly interesting questions for me, because I assume some of you will probably have heard about the story previously. I know it got a lot of notoriety in the area. And then, of course, David, unfortunately, the story doesn't end happily for David. And I know that generated a lot of attention too. But in any case, I do appreciate the invite. I'm going to have to warn you all. I have an 8-month-old daughter. I'm sort of old, but I have 2 kids from an earlier marriage. My 8-month-old is kicking my butt. My wife was just out of town for 4 days and just got back yesterday, and I'm like totally destroyed. So if I appear to be rambling or a little unfocused, that is why. I'm gonna blame my daughter for that. I love her madly, but she's killing me. I wanted to start just by, I talked to Phil, and my understanding is I think some of you have read the book, but not all of you. And I'm just going to sort of tell the story of what happened with David and how the story came to me. That's where I'm going to start. And like I said, I may be a little, I may meander a bit in telling the story, but I will do my best to let you all know what happened. And I hope you'll have some questions at the end. So to begin, I've been a journalist in DC. I've been based in DC for a long time. My first job in journalism was with Associated Press, and I was there from 1989 to 93. And then I came back and moved to Washington, where I've mostly lived since then. And I think, I don't remember exactly, but I believe I heard about the story about 5 or 6 years after I'd moved to DC. And I'd started to build up, when I started out, I was struggling. I could hardly get stories, and I'd become like a little more successful. It was easier to do freelance journalism then. It's become very difficult. But people brought me stories all the time. I was always getting tips about stories, and this one was brought to me by an organization that doesn't exist any longer. It was called the National Security News Service, and I guess it came across their attention because of the nuclear component and the cleanup. It wasn't like exactly right up their angle. They were supposed to be, I think, combating nuclear proliferation. And of course, David was, conducting experiments with items that were radioactive that he, primarily got from household products or, old antiques, which I'll get to in a little bit. So I guess that's how it came across their radar. And, as a journalist, people pitch you a lot of stories. And it's not often that you hear something and right away it's like, okay, this is literally a no-brainer. I mean, you can, how do you go wrong when the basic outline of the story is a teenager in the Detroit suburbs tried to build a nuclear breeder reactor in his backyard in order to get his Boy Scout a merit badge. He was hoping to become an Eagle Scout. And in the course of doing it, he, of course, didn't build a nuclear reactor in his backyard because no one could do that. But he did some pretty extraordinary things, and extraordinary, for better or worse, to the point that the Environmental Protection Agency had to come in moon suits, to the shock and horror of the neighbors who didn't really understand what was going on, that, this young man had been experimenting in the backyard, and that nobody was, in the end, nobody was seriously endangered. David probably exposed himself to more harm than anybody, of course, because he was conducting these experiments in a potting shed in his mother's backyard, and and actually, I think it was at his with his father and stepmother. He moved between these two houses. But in any case, then the neighbors wake up one Saturday morning, and men in moon suits are cutting up the backyard potting shed, moving in and out of the backyard of this home where David lived with his father and stepmother. And I am really sorry. It's been so long since I read the book. It was the father's house. I'm going to double check that as we go. But in any case, you can imagine, I mean, some of them had sort of seen David working in the middle of the night. He's 14, 15, 16 years old. He was obsessed with this project, and they thought it was maybe a little strange. They weren't sure what was going on, but they did not know that he was trying to build a nuclear reactor. And of course, the EPA wasn't really telling them what was going on, so it created a lot of panic. In any case, it's a story, teenager tries to build a nuclear reactor in his backyard and creates a environmental protection agency Superfund site. His laboratory has to be shut down, cut up, and sent out to Utah for burial at a low-level radioactive dump site. I mean, if you're a journalist and you can't do something with that story, then you need to find a new job. So I instantly recognized that this was, a really good project. And yeah, as I said, it was a slam dunk, and I wrote it for Harper's Magazine initially. The day it came out in Harper's, I got a call from Random House, a great editor there, who wanted the book. She made the highest offer. I mean, we did accept bids. Her offer was the best, and she was amazing. She was a great editor, and it's been optioned multiple times for a movie. It's never been made into a movie. It may be getting close now with a smaller independent studio, but there's a dark side of the story, which I think makes it a little bit difficult. But anyway, I should start telling you more about the story itself. But I just wanted to, let you know how it came to me, and because it hadn't really received much attention at that point. There had been a small item in the New York Post. I don't know if any of you, are familiar with New York Post page 6. It's one of my favorite pages in journalism because I do like gossip. It's their big gossip page. And somehow, the David Hahn story ended up there in a small item. That's how it came to the attention of, initially, of National Security News Service, and who brought it to me. Anyway, so basically, I'll try to lay it out succinctly. David is, a teenager in Detroit, actually beginning a little bit before, is younger than that. As a young man, he was a bit unusual. I mean, he became interested in he liked to play basketball, ride his bikes with his friends. It wasn't like he was completely eccentric and strange and had no friends, because he did, but he also became quite obsessed and with things that I think most kids don't, because most kids stay, it's purely the basketball or baseball or whatever, and riding the bikes. And David would become interested. He had this obsession with science from a young age. And he became interested in a breeder reactor. If you don't know what it is, it's like a nuclear reactor, a conventional reactor, except that in theory, it was supposed to produce more energy than it consumed. So it was like this magic cure. It was promoted by the nuclear industry as a magic cure for, the energy crisis. Because, hey, if you put in some, finite amount of energy into it in the form of radioactive material, and it creates more of the fuel than you need, when at the end of the process, it's you're putting the fuel in to generate energy, and at the end of the process of generating the energy, you have more fuel. So, David, his grandfather gave him a book called The Golden Age of Chemistry Experiments. It came out in 1960, which, I'll give away my age. I was 2 at the time. So this is, something I read about later, but this was the era of, there was this tremendous belief in science, that science could solve all of our problems. JFK, was, put a man on the moon, or was, launched the idea of putting a man on the moon. And ultimately, I guess it was 68 when it succeeded, but there was this belief that science could solve everything. And so the breeder reactor, nuclear energy in general, was seen as this miracle. And then the breeder reactor, of course, was going to fix everything, because, hey, there'd be, in 1974, you had the oil embargo on the part of OPEC, and prices went up. And David actually told me that he became interested and sort of what triggered his obsession in a way was that he heard his parents arguing about expenses and utilities and the cost of electricity. And so, as he is a kid, I don't remember at this point exactly how old he was, but he was not a teenager at this point. He was younger. And he thought, well, if I could build a breeder reactor, my parents wouldn't be arguing. That's really what triggered, that was the initial idea that he had. So, he becomes obsessed with the book. He reads it over and over and over. And as he gets older and into his teens, this becomes a complete obsession. And I remember his Boy Scout troop leader told me that, David said something like, David was, most teenagers were interested in fast cars and girls and stuff like that. And, David was interested in the periodic element, and collecting all of the elements on the periodic table. So they became very, very obsessed with science in general. He had zero interest in, he pretty much had zero interest in anything else. He had a girlfriend. So I don't mean anything, but academically, as a high school student, he, like most of us, if you're really interested in a topic, you focus on it, you devote time to it, you take it seriously. And he, was a great student when it came to science, but nothing else really grabbed his attention. And I remember when I met him when I was writing the article for Harper's, and then spent a bunch of time with him when I was writing the book. And I remember being down in Norfolk, Virginia, soon after I got a book contract, and he had joined the Navy. And I just remember, his, partly his obsession, and, where he would become fixated on a project, but it was always in the science realm. It was a reflection in part of, very much in part, his mother had bipolar disorder, tragically committed suicide, and David had bipolar disorder. I don't know how many of you will know much about it, but it typically manifests itself in the early 20s. That's roughly, that's generally when it becomes apparent. When I met him, David, he's a teenager, and he was sure he was eccentric. I mean, he was late teens. I think he was 19. So he was out of high school, but he was eccentric a bit, because obviously, like, to have worked on this project, but his bipolar wasn't apparent at that point. And I didn't, I don't think anybody really was thinking that this was a reflection of it, possibly because of his mother had bipolar disorder. But, I remember meeting him in Norfolk, when it had become apparent. That was the first time when I thought, okay, something's going on other than, a little bit of eccentric behavior. And he was in the Navy, and he wasn't aware. I can't remember exactly what year it was, but it was, it must have been around 2000 or 1999. He was not aware that the Soviet Union had collapsed. Well, he was locked in on whatever it was that he was focused on at that moment, which, for years had been the project, the breeder reactor project, but he didn't hear or see or think about anything else. So it was quite extreme. In any case, he hears about it as a young man, and it's just, he's reading basically comic books, more or less. The Golden Book of Chemistry Experiments. I got his copy from his family, and it was clear he just read it over and over again. And then as he gets into the teen years, he starts, he was able to think about, how could I actually do this? Before it had been like, oh, I can build a reactor, breed a reactor, and my parents will stop arguing. But he was too young to really sort of put this, to implement this idea. But he remained focused on it. And, when he got to the teens, he decided he would give it a go. And then that's where it meets up with the Boy Scouts. He's in the Boy Scouts. And his father had been I think his father had just missed being an Eagle Scout. And so he very much wanted David to basically attain what he hadn't. I don't think David was against that idea. I don't think he was forced into it or anything like that. But he may have felt some pressure to get the become an Eagle Scout. But one of the nuclear industry really, like we see all the time. I mean, private industries are constantly looking to sell their products, whatever they are, to get them into the schools, like where, you buy, it's been a while for me, but, you get your product into school for some, project that everybody has to participate in, or, you promote it in one way or another. And the nuclear industry, wanted to get to kids. They targeted the Boy Scouts. The Boy Scouts was quite a conservative organization overall. And from the beginning of its history. And I don't remember, I don't know if I ever pieced together the entire origin of it, but I know that the industry sought to enlist the support of the Boy Scouts, and the way that they did it, among other things, was, they convinced the Boy Scouts to make getting an atomic energy merit badge, which was, you had to be awarded a certain number of merit badges to become an Eagle Scout. And so that was one of them. So then David's, like I said, I don't think he was, forced into it. I think he liked the Scouts. That's, he certainly conveyed that. So, he's got the, he's got this obsession with science. He's on a quest to build a nuclear reactor. It's an atomic energy merit badge, which is the other main activity. And the other thing is that, David was a little awkward as a teenager. He did, I think he had a girlfriend in the area who I think was his his first girlfriend. He was not like, uh, the captain of the football team or anything like that. Like me, I mean, I didn't get a date throughout all of high school. I mean, when I went into, I was 4'11" and 84 pounds when I went into high school. David, it wasn't his physical stature, but he was awkward with girls, but he got a girlfriend, and she and other people, because he was awkward, uh, but people were really, really impressed with his knowledge of science and his ability to do things. And so, he got a lot of great feedback about that. So it all fed into it. It sort of bolstered the quest, which was a crazy quest. I mean, crazy in the sense of, impractical, against all odds. And, a teenager wasn't going to do it in his backyard. But, when you're a teenager, you think you can do anything. And so it all bolstered and fed into this idea. When he was a teenager, one of the things he was able to do before he got to the nuclear idea, he made homemade fireworks. And so he apparently made extremely impressive homemade fireworks that were very colorful, and people were really impressed with that. It made him cool. And so again, it was like a perfect storm where everything, and not in a bad way necessarily at all. So I mean, I don't want to suggest it was a negative thing. I mean, he did dangerous things, and he definitely needed more supervision. But he ultimately achieved pretty extraordinary things. But it I mean, it required a lot, I think, to get him to the point where he worked on this for years. And he, as I said, he did some extraordinary things, which again, I know, like, just indulge me. I've slept like 6 hours in the past 4 or 5 days.
You're doing great.
Oh, good. Okay, good. So anyway, he he starts doing experiments in the house. And he starts in the basement. And I remember his parents, his stepmother told me that first, actually, he started in the bedroom, and then they made him go downstairs to the basement because they'd hear these explosions, and he would be testing stuff out, and like little fires and little explosions, and the carpet was burned, the walls were pockmarked. And so they sent him down to the basement, and nobody was really paying super close attention for a while. I mean, they were concerned about this, but hey, I did stuff like this all the time as a kid. I mean, not precisely the same thing, but I mean, I played around with I didn't make my own fireworks, but me and my friends shot them off at each other. Bottle rockets. We had bottle rocket fights. I mean, it's a miracle any of us survived. And so it wasn't like, hey, this was like post Mad Men era, but I watched Mad Men, and I remember, sitting in my father's lap and driving in the car, and, as he drove the car, and, seat belts. Are you kidding? Like, it was just a different era. And like, and again, in my case, I remember they were building a freeway. I grew up in St. Louis, and they were building a freeway. And me and my friends would run down there after it opened up and cross the freeway. Nobody knew where the hell we were at. Our parents didn't really know. And it was just, it was a different era. So there wasn't as much supervision. David, of course, was younger than me, but even then, it's earlier than the current period where I think parents are, for better and sometimes for worse, paying a little bit more attention. So anyway, he's sort of destroying his room. So they ban him to the basement. And then, one day, his parents are up in the living room, and they hear a pretty significant explosion in the basement. They go running down there, and David is laying, like, conscious, but laying on the floor. He'd been experimenting with red mercury, which is very easy to trigger, apparently, if you I think he was hitting with a hammer or something like that. You're not supposed to do that. He triggered an explosion, and there's smoke rising above his body laying on the ground. And then, they got more concerned, but they didn't banish him from conducting experiments, but then he had to move to a potting shed. and and in the potting shed, there was even less supervision because he was out there working all the time, late at night, by himself. And he was, very, very unsupervised out there. It was, so I do remember, like, there were people who, and I am checking, I apologize because I thought I remembered some of the details better than I did. It was, okay, I did find it. His mother and her, I don't think they were married, her boyfriend, who she was living with, lived out in Gulf Manor, which was about, I think it was about 30 or 45 minutes from where he lived with his father and stepmother. And that's where the potting shed was. And I think, they remembered, I mean, unfortunately, his mother died, committed suicide. I didn't meet her, but I spoke to his effectively his stepfather. And I remember, they thought, like, well, looked out the window at 2 a.m. and the potting shed was glowing. And, but nobody, like, David was excited about everything he was doing, and he wasn't tremendously forthcoming about what he was doing. Which, had he been, like, I think it would have triggered some sort of crackdown, which of course is why he didn't do it. But, I mean, at this time, I think, parents would have been more proactive. But at the time, for whatever reason, David continued on with his experiments. And I want to be clear too, I'm not passing judgment on the parents. I mean, life is complicated. I have 2 kids from an earlier marriage. I'm pretty, I did, I'm a mad, my parents, it was Mad Men era. And it certainly, if my child now at this point was, laying on the floor of the basement with smoke coming up, above their body, and they were semi-conscious, I would have intervened. But I can't say for sure that back at the time, that I would have, because I'm pretty, I don't know. I mean, I would say liberal in what I let my kids do. Other people might say reckless, but as a my son and my daughter, until she got a little older, but my son loved fireworks, and hey, look, I love fireworks. We played with them all the time. My son still loves fireworks. So do I, to tell you the truth. So I like the 4th of July. I mean, the neighborhood kids here, where I live now, I set them off with the kids here, and their parents don't care. So, but for whatever reason, without in any way speaking badly of the parents, because I don't know, who knows, what I would have done myself. He did not have a whole lot of supervision, and he did some things that he definitely should not have been doing. Which leads to, what was he doing? Why was the potting shed glowing? Why were these explosions going off? And what was the plan to build a nuclear reactor? So basically, he starts studying up on, he discovers that you can get radioactive materials in some household products, like americium, which is still used, but no longer quite as easy to extract from. I think it's still used in smoke alarms, but it may not be. But like he discovered you could, through his research, that you could. It was in smoke detectors and other household products. So he starts writing. He had to figure out how to obtain these things. He didn't have a lot of money. He's a teenager. So he wrote to a smoke detector, fire detector, a company that produces these, and his cover story was that I think he was a high school teacher, and he had experiments that he wanted to perform with his class or show his class. And did they have any, could they send him surplus? And they did it. He was quite resourceful. I mean, extraordinarily resourceful. So he gets the americium that way. He's got a shopping list of elements he needs. And I think the three main ones were americium, radium, and and uranium. Okay, so of course he's not obtaining, laboratory grade stuff. He was trying to get the best he could. And again, like, this was never going to work in the long run. But he had to, those were the three main things. So the americium he got from the smoke detectors. The radium he discovers is, it was used to paint clocks, and so he starts looking for antique clocks and watch styles in the old days. I mean, and this was a terrible idea, because I forget what they call the women. It was mostly women, I think entirely women, who were painting the face of the clock with the hands of the clock with radium, and they used a radium paint, and the women would dip the toothbrush into their mouth, make to wet it, to make a fine point, and then put it into the paint, and weren't terribly careful about making sure it was clean when they did it again. And a lot of them died of of cancer. I mean, they came down with cancer. There were a lot of deaths. The radium dial girls, or women, they were called. So David, though, discovers this. He has a Geiger counter. He obtains a Geiger counter, and he mounts it in his car, and he goes driving around Detroit, the Detroit area, the suburbs, and I think the city as well, to junkyards and antique stores, with his Geiger counter, to test clocks, antique clocks. And he scores some he gets a certain amount, and then he hits the jackpot, I guess. He told me that he goes into one shop, and the Geiger counter just basically goes crazy the minute he walks in the door. He doesn't really know why, but he buys the clock, takes it home, and I'm sure some of you have seen, the old wall-mounted clocks, antique clocks, and there's a little drawer in the side. Well, he opens the drawer. That's where they kept the radium paint, and there was a vial of it, or like a little paint vial filled with radium paint that was still, radioactive enough that it set off his Geiger counter. He then had to purify to the best of his ability the radium, but that's how he got it. That was the main source. And the uranium, which he didn't really, naturally, he didn't really obtain much, but he like wrote the Atomic Energy Commission, again, I think in the guise of a high school teacher looking for information for his students, and asking how he could obtain small, safe amounts of uranium to for this experiment for his class again. And they told him, I mean, the guy at the Atomic Energy Commission, who is supposed to be making sure that nuclear materials are are safeguarded, tells him how to find it. So he ordered it. You could order it. And again, obviously, we're not talking about something with significant amounts, but enough that it triggered something in his on his Geiger counter. It was, it had some degree of it was generating some degree of radioactivity. So he has his materials. He does something, he figures out like he reads about how to purify them to refine his products to the best that he can possibly do. And then he needed a gun. He needed to I think he needed the americium to the idea was to take to build like I'm trying to find the name, and again I apologize because I have had very little time until today to really start reviewing this, and I'm not finding it immediately, but I think it was called a radium it was the americium, maybe it was the radium. I think it may I'll try to find it, but he had to build what he called a gun, and into which he put one of the elements to target the other two, and the idea being to transform them into to make them more radioactive, which was essential to his reactor project. I mean, it was he was trying to create the fuel, which and so he had to, enrich it was the idea with God, I think it was the I'm gonna find it. I believe it's the I actually think it's the americium that he used for the gun, but let me try to find it as I continue to talk. So he does this. I mean, he he whatever he did, he got far enough that he's measuring the fuel that he's producing, and he's actually at some point he gets nervous because he's realizing he's doing something right or very wrong depending on your perspective, because he is doing something. He's not enriching the radioactive elements into laboratory grade fuel, but he's doing something that is increasing the radioactivity that is in the what's supposed to be the fuel in the reactor. And he begins, it's giving off more generating, it's becoming more radioactive because it's registering on his Geiger counter. And then he notices that it's like the potting shed in his mother and stepfather's house was where he kept most of this stuff, and he begins to notice that the Geiger counter is beginning to be triggered from a greater and greater distance. So he is doing something. I mean, we know he's doing something because the feds come in and cut up his potting shed and have to bury it out in Utah. But he notices himself that, when he becomes worried finally, again, when you're a teenager, you think you're immortal and you do all sorts of stuff that, because of that, because it never occurs to you that you could be creating danger for yourself or anyone else. David was not out to, he wasn't like intending to, he wasn't a terrorist. He wasn't going to like blow up his school. He intended no harm. And so, he was alarmed to discover this. It didn't, I don't think it really is that. Yeah, I heard different. He suggested to me that that's what really brought about the end of the experiment, because he decided to shut it down. I mean, the feds learned about it later. The feds. What happened was and why I don't really necessarily think that it was his own decision to shut it down because he was alarmed. I do think he was alarmed. But what happened was David kept most of the stuff out there. But he took some of it and put it into an old toolbox, which he taped shut with duct tape, and he had a bunch of the radioactive material in there. And he had it in the trunk of his car. He had an old Pontiac, I think, that he drove around in. That's where how he drove around to the junkyards. And he kept it there. And he got arrested one night, or he got stopped by the police. And there's some dispute about what was actually going on. The cops thought he was stealing tires from a car in the neighborhood where they saw him. It was late at night and all. And I think that's probably what happened. Uh, uh, but David portrayed it somewhat more innocently. I think he was embarrassed about it, but I can only tell you all tonight. And I told David I did way worse. I mean, I did some. I mean, I wasn't holding up banks or anything, but it was, whatever, shoplifting, breaking into homes, like way worse than David did, but not with, I didn't have radioactive material in my car. So David, the cops spot this young guy. They think he's stealing tires. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. And they search his car, uh, and they find the toolbox in the trunk. And, this is sort of like Keystone Cops. They speak to him. He does tell them something about it. He doesn't tell them anything about uh, the stuff that he's got out of the potting shed. He tells them that it's all, everything he's got. He'd been doing experiments and it's all in the trunk of his car. They never did search the house at that point. and they but then they made a decision to tow the car, which they had begun to fear might possibly have a atomic weapon in it, a nuclear bomb. They tow this car with what they think maybe a bomb to police headquarters, and then they realize, oh, we may have just they have to seal off the police headquarters, basically, the area around where they've towed the car, and call in the bomb squad. And they open it up, and it's not a bomb, of course. I mean, I'm sure they tested it before opening it. And they open up the toolbox, and that's the first indication that something problematic is happening. And then they don't search the house. David does not tell them about all the other stuff that's out there. But in the course of, over the next few weeks, I believe he tells his parents, or he may have told one of the police officers, but he does, they learn, and it's, I think the information comes from David, that he's got this potting shed. That's when, the police, the local police, they did have some, I wouldn't say necessarily expertise, but I think they had somebody on staff, and like, this is above my pay grade. That's when they alert the Environmental Protection Agency. I think they come in and look into it and decide, okay, this is a problem. We got to take care of it. They don't tell the neighbors, which is really, like, they should have done. But government bureaucrats, I think, frequently, it's not just government bureaucrats, it's private companies. If they've got a problem, I mean, like, think back to the movie Jaws, right? The town doesn't want anybody to know that there's a deadly shark attacking people, because it'll drive away the tourists in summer season. There's an instinct, not a healthy one, but in it's not just government, but people who might be responsible for a problem, want to keep it under wraps as much as possible. Which is a terrible impulse. In this case, they didn't tell the neighbors, and that's what led to the alarm when they actually come in. It's a weekend morning, and the neighbors are like, what is going on? They have no idea. I mean, there are a lot of alarming things I can think about, like, you wake up in the morning and there's a robber, but you at least, like, there's somebody standing outside your house with a gun. I that's probably worse ultimately, but at least how to process it. Is like, okay, there's a guy with a gun out there. I call the police. I hide under the bed. You know what's happening. You don't know what's happening when, out of nowhere, with no warning, a team of people in moon suits and government vehicles, clearly, are going in and out of the backyard, and they see that they're cutting up the potting shed. Then I think there were people, like the people who'd seen the potting shed glowing, or had got a glimmer into what David was doing experiments, started putting things together. But even then, it was only much later that they learned exactly what was going on, and that fortunately they weren't endangered. But I mean, I can imagine that morning they were quite terrified. Anyway, I mean, it's now 7:45. I I've covered the main points. I mean, if there are questions, there are a few things I will add if possibly that may be elicited during the questions, if there are any, and if there aren't any questions, then I'll add them myself. So, but I'm going to stop my presentation here.
I'm we've got one question, and I'm going to ask you a question right off the bat. Did he win the atomic energy badge?
Hell yes. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, that a number of things I'm sure I'll remember later and think, why didn't I include? Yeah, he got the Atomic Energy Merit Badge. I mean, the thing was that the Atomic Energy Merit Badge didn't require. I mean, look, it's the Boy Scouts, right? It's teenagers. I mean, mostly what you had to do was assemble like ping pong balls or household products, ping pong balls and straws, and make them into the shape of, like the rate, the element on the periodic table or whatever. It was pretty simple stuff. And meanwhile, David at the time is already, trying to build a reactor in his backyard. He went above and beyond the minimum, and yeah, he got the Atomic Energy Merit Badge. Like he aced that one. Yeah. So.
Excellent. Mark asks, just curious, do you know if by chance David had ever watched the 80s film Manhattan Project with John Lithgow? It's a fictional movie that tells the story of a similar sort of storyline. Do you remember him ever mentioning that movie?
He never mentioned. I think because I did spend quite a bit of time with him, I think that would have probably come out. He never mentioned it as an inspiration. In the 1980s, I'm trying to think, like David. I mean, it would have, it would have fit the time period, I think, roughly, but I don't recall him ever mentioning that. It was all, I mean, he did. The main thing he talked about was the original inspiration, the Golden Book of Chemistry experiments. I do remember, he read a ton of stuff. He got his hands on as much as he could, but I don't remember ever mentioning a movie.
Well, it probably came from his own mind, his own amazing mind.
Yeah, exactly.
Mark also asks, which city or jurisdiction of police pulled him over and towed the car? I don't know if you remember that.
Let me try to find that.
If it's not readily available, no worries. I'll take this moment to say we do have Ken's book. It's in our local history section. We love it when we have a local history book that's more than just Detroit. It's hyper local in this case. So someone's got to check that right now, but you can always put it on hold.
And I mean,
encourage you all.
If it serves any purpose, I could send it to you. I mean,
Yeah.
Afterwards, but it was Clinton Township and was, but what it was Manor Lake.
I've gotten a reference question asking about, did you say Golf Manor?
Golf Manor, yeah, it was Golf
Yeah,
Manor.
I had a reference question about Golf Manor, and someone was wanting to know all about the history of Golf Manor. And it wasn't until I read about your book that I put two and two together, and I feel pretty certain that that patron was researching the whereabouts of this shed and property.
It was Commerce Township, if that means anything.
Okay.
That's where the shed was, and that's where he probably was arrested near there because but I mean, I'm trying to find where his father and stepmother lived, but his mother and her boyfriend, like, effectively stepfather, lived in Commerce Township.
Okay. All right. Yeah, not too far.
Yeah.
That might be our only two questions. If anyone else has a question. Oh, there's one. Catherine has one. She's asking if David is still in the area. David passed away, Catherine. He passed away as a young man.
Yeah, David was, the bipolar manifested itself, and quite severely. Where he had, he like delusions. I mean, he would call me saying that he had spoken to the Queen of England, literally. And I will say, because I'm not embarrassed about it, but very, very, very strangely, in 2015, I began a 7-year period of undiagnosed bipolar disorder myself. So I in no way, it's a bear to handle. And, David did not want to, David had a stepbrother who also had bipolar. His mother had bipolar, and he didn't want to take medication, and he wasn't forced to, which I'm not sure forcing someone to take medication is like generally a great idea. But because it was untreated, he, he suffered in a way that uh, was pretty he suffered delusions, and he lost he lost his grip on reality. And he it contributed to a whole lot of problems. I he had a drinking problem, and it all, I mean, it wasn't the experiments that led to his death directly. It was more of a alcohol and drug abuse problem. But, interestingly enough, despite having written the book, I, this went through this very, late onset, very, very late in terms of, as I said before, it's normally something that manifests itself in the early 20s. I didn't recognize it. And, one of the, I expect this is partly the problem with David. I never suffered the same level. I never was imagining that I had conversations or like anything like that. But like I my judgment was impaired. I misinterpreted things. I was easily triggered into arguments and all sorts of stuff. It was undiagnosed for 7 years. I didn't recognize it. And one of the things about bipolar that's just absolutely horrible, nefarious, I would say, it is that bipolar mania is like the most extraordinary feeling in the world. I certainly, can't, I don't think there could possibly be a better pharmaceutical, an illegal or legal drug that can make you feel like that. I mean, I would be up 20 hours a day happy, and I was pretty functional, but I just like misinterpreted stuff and would get into fights with editors and friends, and, burned a bunch of bridges. And then, it was diagnosed, but I had no idea. And it's like, you feel so good. Like, I think there were people, family members and friends, who said there's something wrong. There was a couple of people who actually said, I know you have bipolar. I've seen it in other friends. And, I just like, you feel so good. I think partly it's, you don't believe it. If I feel this good, then how can there be something seriously wrong with me? And also, I think at some level you think, if this is like, if this is wrong, I don't want to fix it, because you're just, I mean, as I said, I was up 20 hours a day. So I think David didn't believe he had bipolar. He didn't treat it. And unfortunately, it contributed to, it wasn't, as I said, I've never heard anything that indicates that the experiments were directly responsible for, he didn't come down with cancer. It was other problems that were related to the bipolar. And again, I say with all respect, bipolar is a, the idea that I would have had to struggle with it myself, it is a bear. And it's a hard thing to deal with. And I was much older, and I had a very hard time dealing with it. I was older and wiser, as they say, and I really was. As a teen, in your early 20s, I cannot imagine. That is really going to be a difficult time to acknowledge that you've got a problem and to deal with it properly. So
Yeah, it was an
unfortunately,
unfortunate end to a kind of an
yeah,
amazing young man.
yeah.
Um, that's the last of our questions. Your article from Harper's on the subject is online. I just discovered it, and of course the book. I heard about that from a patron too. I think we had it, and then sometimes our materials walk away. We have to reorder it. And when he mentioned it, that, oh, your library needs to have this book, and I read about it. I'm like, oh, this is an amazing story. And I'm so pleased that you are willing to share your time with us and tell us your experience in learning about the story and writing about it. If anyone else has any other questions for Ken, you all should have my email. I think the Zoom link for today's program came from my email, so feel free to shoot me a question and I can share it with Ken. But thank you so much, Ken, for sharing your time and expertise with us this evening.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I enjoyed it. And if anybody has any questions subsequently, or you do, shoot me an email, and you can put any questions to Phil, and I happily respond if anything comes up.